For most of us, we don't know what companies and governments are collecting about us. We scroll through terms of service to click OK so that we can rapidly download this app to connect with our teammates or our friends or our family or whatever, without really realizing what exactly we've just agreed to.
Our project sees privacy as being really important, but there's also a need, and especially in an era of big data or data-based surveillance, to go beyond privacy and to think in terms of what we might think of as data justice. Surveillance makes people visible to organizations, agencies, corporations of all kinds. So it makes people visible by collecting data on them, but it doesn't just do that. It also represents them in terms of those data. And so we're not represented in terms that we might introduce ourselves to one another in a particular way and say who we are and what we do and where we live and so on. We are represented to these agencies, corporations, and so on by those data, not by a way that we might choose.
Whenever it comes to the use of public data, I think there's no good explanation to not say that consent is critical, that people should be informed about how their data is being used, what it's being used for, how long it's being stored. And if that can't be provided, I think there's something probably fundamentally wrong with why that data is being collected.
It would be difficult for the average person to understand the data flows, to understand that the information that they might be providing on their phone for a particular service is then being packaged and repackaged and sent off into different directions to other parties who may then be repackaging that stuff and sending it on. That information asymmetry and then also just the lack of recourse for individuals makes these problems really, really difficult to resolve.
And I think a key element of inclusive, deliberative, democratic governance is you make a decision now, and you return to the decision, and you return to the decision, and you return to the decision. As our communities diversify, they change, they move, they just come to different conclusions. And if we see consent as say yes once and forever, we are adopting the worst parts of contract law into our daily lives. And it doesn't work well for contract law, and it certainly doesn't work well for daily life, especially when we're talking about practices that have the potential to very seriously impede on our basic freedoms and rights. We should be able to say, we made a mistake, or no, we actually do want that. That is the right choice for our community.
Do companies even quite understand the ramifications of the surveillance they're engaging in? Do law enforcement agencies, when they start using Clearview AI and facial recognition, do they really even understand themselves the implications of what can happen down the road and what can happen in the long run? It's not clear that they even do. We could have laws around specific kinds of technology and surveillance, but because it's constantly changing, we also need a framework that's based in rights, in human rights, and that can adapt as new technology comes along.
I think that in the Canadian context, a clear articulation of these challenges and problems hasn't really been done before.
Our personal information is moving between public and private bodies more frequently and trying to obscure in some ways the ability of the person to know how it is being used and what the impacts on it are.
We don't always think about the surveillance tools that we have in our lives and our homes as surveillance tools, right? They're sold to us as efficient things to make our lives easier, to make it, quicker, whatever. And those are also, I think, false promises in the sense that we're promised a thing and we get that thing, but what else is happening in the background? And it's really important for people to think about that.
One revenue stream from the company is when you pay for their product. And the second, and probably larger revenue stream for them, is figuring out ways to monetize the data that you create simply by using the tool that you paid for in the first place. It is absolutely true that it is the granular, detailed information about us that's increasingly being collected, whether we know it or not, as we move through the online world, that is facilitating the social sorting that is then exacerbating the filter bubbles that feed disinformation.
I don't think that there's a really strong argument for there not being good transparency measures about the types of technology that are being used, the vendors that are being brought in by the police or by other government organizations, that involve new technologies that haven't been very rigorously necessarily evaluated yet. So those types of things, reporting on statistics about usage, right? Aggregate statistics, how often is it used? In what types of circumstances does it tend to be used? These are things that usually only emerge after, in a reactive way, after there's been some kind of a revelation, right? So it comes out in the media that the police are using it, an academic pieces things together, that type of a situation, or it's, for whatever reason, an investigation gets launched, and then only after years of work do we uncover everything, we file a report, and then it enters the public domain.
This is where we are right now. We live our lives online. Data is the number one asset of the internet. Data is moving governments in new ways. I think we also need to talk about data climate change and how we can get the right regulations and the right safeguards and guardrails around the use of data. And companies need to step up, commercial entities and government, to realize data is not just X's and O's, it's not just ones and zeros, it's real people. And how do we make sure that we're protecting society along the way?